Australia's involvement in the First World War began when Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914. The localities within what is now known as the Gannawarra Shire heeded Britain's call to arms. Both men and women from Kerrang, Kahuna, Kundruk, Lake Charm, Mystic Park, Lalbert, Quambatook, Leachville, Tregowl and surrounding areas came forward to do their bit for the war effort. This included signing up to the Australian Imperial Force, known as the AIF, as well as supporting those serving overseas. At the time war broke out, the Gannawarra area was predominantly a farming region, as it is today. During 1914 and early 1915, farmers had it tough, with a severe drought strangling the water supply and drying up the Murray River completely. Vehicles were driven to the bottom for family picnics, while the pinch was felt all through the district. It's possible that the scarcity of farm labouring opportunities was a factor in the young men signing up to go to war. Many men of the district signed up to serve through the Kerrang recruitment office. Some also made their way to Bendigo or Melbourne to enlist. Most recruits were gratefully received, although some were quickly returned home when it was discovered that their birth date was forged, meaning they were not yet of age. Alan McGowan's mother, Elizabeth, wrote to the Defence Department to let them know that Alan, who came from Wee Wee Rup near Kahuna, was not only just 18 years old, but also had a heart condition. He was the youngest of her 4 sons, 2 of whom had already lost their lives to the war and 1 was still serving at Gallipoli. Alan had previously tried to enlist at Kerrang, where he was rejected, so he made his way to Melbourne to enlist instead. On questioning, Private McGowan admitted that he changed his birth certificate and was discharged after only 15 days in the AIF. Once signed up, troops made their way to one of several training camps before departing overseas. Large groups of men sleeping and eating together was a breeding ground for diseases, many of which are preventable and treatable today. They claimed lives even before the fighting started. Joseph Michael Armstrong, who signed up to serve at Kerrang, was sadly taken before he set foot on foreign soil. He died in hospital at Broadmeadows on the 11th of May 1915 from heart failure arising from measles. He is remembered on the Shire Honour Roll at the Council Chambers in Kerrang. By mid-1915, the rains had come and people rejoiced to see the Murray, Loddon and Avoca rivers running again. The drought was finally broken and 1915 produced record crops. Farmers and their sons were toiling from dawn until after dusk each day, stripping, bagging and carting wheat for the Empire. Once harvest had finished for the season, Sam and Bert Free of Lalbert enlisted together on the 24th of July 1916 in Melbourne, second and third eldest of 10 children. They were both allocated to the 15th Machine Gun Company and did their initial training at the large army camp at Seymour in central Victoria. On the 20th of October 1916, together with hundreds of other young men, they lined up on the docks at Port Melbourne to board the troop ship ready to take them to war. They sailed west past Perth and then on towards South Africa, where they made a brief stop at the port of Durban, before continuing up towards Cape Town and across the equator. In these dangerous waters, a German submarine began stalking the ship and chased it into the port of Freetown in Sierra Leone, where, without a pilot, it ran onto a sandbar, luckily within the harbour. The men disembarked and waited a week for a new transport ship to take them on to England, where they arrived 3 days after Christmas, 1916. On arriving in England, the brothers spent some 5 months training on the Salisbury Plains at camp in Perham Downs before departing for France in May 1917. The boys were posted to the 10th Machine Gun Company and were to serve together in the No. 6 team of the company's 3rd section, joining their unit just after the Battle of Messines in Belgium. By the 3rd Battle of Ypres at the end of July, the brothers were entrenched at Messines, some 12 kilometres below Ypres. The 10th Machine Gun Company were tasked with providing a moving barrage towards Passendale, where the Germans had dug in. The area they were crossing to get to their staging point had just been won from the enemy, and consequently was badly broken up by gunfire into a series of shell holes. This and continuing driving rain made the ground almost impassable except along the duckboard tracks which had been laid the previous day. These were also visible to the enemy, and so the approaching soldiers found they were being accurately shelled, not only with high explosive, but at some points with mustard gas. Those who got off the duckboards risked being drowned in the sodden shell holes, or in the pitch dark found themselves crawling over the bodies of British soldiers who had been killed or wounded in the lead-up attack. During the move to the assembly point, Bert became separated from the No. 6 team and was listed as wounded and missing in action. The family wrote to the Australian Red Cross in London, requesting they look into the matter. This yielded a letter from a private in the company who confirmed that Bert had been wounded with a machine gun bullet and was left behind as they advanced. He related that nothing was heard of him afterwards and all kinds of inquiries were held, but with no result. It wasn't until a year later that a court of inquiry confirmed Bert had been killed that day in the attack at Passendale. Sam stayed on with the 10th Machine Gun Company into 1918, going on to fight at the Somme and Villers-Bretonneux. Then, in an unlucky series of events, Sam was wounded on the 25th of May. In a letter sent home by a friend, the family learned that Sam had bumped his head and was ordered by the company medical officer to remove himself from the line for a rest. He caught a ride on a ration wagon heading back from the line. As they were coming out of Villers-Bretonneux, a shell burst next to the vehicle and 2 pieces of shrapnel were embedded in his abdomen. He was taken to a nearby casualty clearing station, but never awoke and passed away the following day. A ceremony was held at the school in Lalbert to honour the servicemen from the area. Sam and Bert's young brothers, sisters and parents planted sugar gums in their memory with brass plaques, which were later moved to the town's war memorial. The Free family may have been given reason to hope, as a small number of men who had previously been reported missing were later reported as prisoners of war. This was the case for Frank Dean of Cow Swamp near Leachville, who signed up to serve in Bendigo in July 1915. Then, only 24 years old, he is listed as single and a farmer. After training at Broadmeadows, he embarked to Europe, arriving in France March 1916. By July, he was reported missing. In a statement written after his repatriation, Frank describes what happened to him during the years he was a prisoner of the German army.
My battalion took part in the assault on the enemy position at Pozières, our particular objective being his first line. We hopped over at 12:26 a.m. on the 25th of July 1916 and got into no man's land to wait for our barrage. After a 20-minute barrage, we advanced to the Germans' first line, losing about 30 men in getting there. We found that the Fritz had vacated his front trench. An order was passed along from Captain Lilly, 5th Battalion, to advance to the enemy's second line about 250 yards distant. We had no barrage to assist us in this advance, and the enemy got onto us with intense artillery and machine gun fire. I was wounded twice. When I had just got through the enemy wire entanglements, an explosive bullet hit me just below the right elbow, fracturing the bone and another bullet got me in the right hip. I lay where I fell for about 3 hours and then tried to get back, but was picked up by a German patrol just before daybreak. I was taken to a clearing station and then to hospital. I was a fortnight here, the treatment and food being very decent. Then I was moved to Göttingen camp in Germany, where we were starved. The medical attention was very fair, but their wounds were bandaged only once every 5 days.
Frank moved to a series of camps during his years as a prisoner of war. First he went to Langensalza, where the entire camp was punished after an escaped attempt by 2 NCOs. They were banned from cooking for 14 days. Small offences were punished by being locked in a cell with only bread and water. Parades were held at all hours. Those who were late were made to stand to attention for hours at a time in the snow. Frank was then moved to Kassel, where he was sent out into the forest to work, and despite his injured arm swelling, he stayed there for 4 months. Next, Frank and 8 others were moved to a farm near Kassel, where he worked for 11 months.
In June 1918, I found the food getting worse and the work increasing, so I walked into Kassel. For this I was punished by 5 days, dark cells, and 1 slice of bread and water per diem, and a bowl of soup on the 4th day only. I had no blankets and was not even allowed an overcoat in the cell. When I finished the punishment, I was ill and went to hospital with what was called grippe. I stayed there until after the armistice was signed.
Frank was repatriated to England on the 4th of January 1919 after 2 years and 6 months as a prisoner of war in Germany. He disembarked in Australia on the 31st of May that same year. Frank went on to marry Catherine Ormandy and stayed in the Cow Swamp and Leachville area to raise 16 children. He didn't speak much about his experience of World War I until his twilight years, and passed away in 1966, 10 years after his wife. Enlistment records from the Gannawarra region indicate that quite a number of new recruits to the AIF were English expatriates. 2 of these were William Heap and Albert Taylor, both of whom worked at King's Bakery in Kahuna. On the night of the 20th of March 1915, they stealthily left Kahuna and enlisted together in Kerrang, then made their way to Broadmeadows for training. William later sent a letter detailing what happened when the steamer ship HMS Southland, carrying them from Alexandria to Gallipoli, was hit by a torpedo. It was published in the local paper.
Dear brother and sister, just a few lines to say I'm still alive and kicking. We had a taste of a torpedo from one of the enemy submarines. They fired 2 torpedoes, 1 missed but we got the other. I was still in bed reading at the time, but I was soon up. When the torpedo hit the ship, we all put our life belts on and rushed for the boats. I got into one boat and they started lowering it when someone let go. One end of the boat went down and nearly everyone who were in it fell into the sea. As soon as I felt the boat going, I grabbed a rope. I was hanging on for dear life until a chap got hold of my legs and pulled me back onto the rails again. After that, I waited until the boat reached the water, then slid down a rope onto it. I did not want to experience that same thing again. You can imagine what it was like if you've seen a picture of a sinking ship. Boats all over the place, men swimming about, and some drowning. We were out in the boats for 3.5 hours before we were picked up. As luck would have it, the ship did not go down. They managed to ground her.
William and Albert were parted in September 1916 when Albert was reported missing and then confirmed as a prisoner of war in Germany. In 1918 he was repatriated to England and then on to Australia. Both Albert and William came back to settle near Kahuna after the war, though they were not without scars. Albert had been poisoned with mustard gas by the Germans, and both men had sustained gunshot wounds. The men continued their lives in the area, both marrying local women and raising families. Only 12 years separates the end of the Boer War and the start of the First World War. This meant that some men signed up to fight in both conflicts. One such man was Christopher Jorgensen. The Jorgensen family of Kerrang were well known in the district as brickmakers and carpenters. They were wealthy and owned a timber and iron yard in Fitzroy Street, Kerrang. Christopher Jorgensen, also known as Chris, attended the Kerrang State School and, after graduating, went into the family businesses. When he signed up to serve on the 1st of March 1916, Christopher was a Boer War veteran, aged 40, and a family man with a wife and 5 children. After embarking for Europe in December 1916, Chris was quickly promoted to corporal in early 1917. His prior war experience served him well, as he spent only 1 month in France before being transferred back to England as a commanding officer and trainer at the School of Instruction in Tidworth, England, later going on to Hayling Island School of Musketry, also as an instructor. Here he gained experience with the Lewis machine gun. It wasn't until December 1917 that Chris rejoined his unit and was headed for the front once more. 6 months later, in June 1918, Chris is admitted to hospital in France with a gunshot wound to the buttock. He was treated and convalesced for a month before marching out to rejoin his unit. Chris's battalion then took part in the Second Battle of the Somme. This was a successful push by the Allies to gain back the area in northern France taken by the Germans during their spring offensive of 1918. Near the end of September, the AIF was tasked with taking Mont Saint-Quentin near Peronne to break the German supply line. During this assault, only 3 months before the end of the war, a shell landed next to Chris, killing him instantly. His body was buried where he lay, but was later moved to the Peronne Communal Cemetery. Christopher Jorgensen does not appear on the honour rolls in the Gannawarra Shire. The reason for this is unknown. However, his mother funded the extension of a new classroom to the Kerrang State School in his memory. Until recently, a photo of Chris hung in the entry to the school. Australians fought on the land, sea and in the air, a world away from their families and loved ones. Roby Lewis Manuel spent much of his early life at Normanville, midway between Kerrang and Quambatook. He was orphaned at 13 years of age and found himself living in Adelaide with an aunt, and then 2 years later with an uncle share farming at Brim, near Warwick Nabil. When war broke out, Roby made his way to Adelaide and enlisted on the 5th of April 1916. His age was given at 20 years and 4 months. Before leaving for Europe, he married his love, Millicent Freeman, in Horsham at 5 p.m. on the 8th of June. The newlyweds spent 7 hours together, and then Roby caught the midnight train to Adelaide, embarking the next day. By November that year, he was marching into France after several months of training. He survived 5 months in the trenches, and then, after much harassing of senior officers, he was transferred to the Australian Flying Corps. His training took place at the Shawbury Aerodrome in England over the next 8 months, where he graduated as a pilot and obtained the rank lieutenant in December 1917. At this time, the life expectancy of an active pilot was just 3 months. Roby was deployed to France in early February 1918, attached to the 2nd Squadron. Germany had just launched their spring offensive, moving 500,000 men from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, pushing easily through the Allied lines and advancing towards France. Desperate orders came through from London stating, "These squadrons are to bomb and shoot up everything they see. Very low flying is essential. All risks to be taken. Urgent." The second was to be a circus squadron, with the aim of roving groups of aircraft to harass and destroy all enemies they find. Between the 4th of April and the 24th of September, Roby became a captain in his squadron and shot down 13 enemy aircraft. Most engagements were dogfights over enemy territory and carried the threat of being taken prisoner if they were shot down. It is reported that by the time the Red Baron was shot down and killed on the 21st of April 1918, Roby and his squadron had clashed with him 6 times. The Red Baron commanded approximately 30 aircraft, and Roby nicknamed him the Fox for the way he would hang above a fight, letting his squad bear the brunt of the action and picking off the aircraft with engine trouble or who were returning home after emptying their ammunition. Roby earned the Distinguished Flying Cross after he shot down an enemy fighter, but sustained severe damage to his plane. As he limped his aircraft home, he noticed another enemy craft below him. Even with the state of his aircraft, he attacked and successfully gunned down the other plane. He subsequently earned the bar to the Distinguished Flying Cross when his patrol of 11 aircraft engaged a squad of 15 hostile craft. After a 20-minute battle, only 4 enemy fighters were left in the air to retreat. The war ended in November 1918, and on Anzac Day the next year, Roby was to lead a large group of aircraft in a victorious flyover of London. His orders stated, "No very low flying, nor practices in aerobatics are to be carried out over London." When his moment came, Roby did a loop-the-loop, and then all the aircraft flew low through the streets of London, finishing off by flying around Trafalgar Square and under Tower Bridge, wowing the crowds. He returned to Australia the next week. Roby returned to his young wife, and together they settled back at his childhood home of Normanville, farming and raising 8 children. Roby continued to fly with 2 aircraft he kept on the farm, earning him the nickname the Flying Farmer. A memorial plaque was installed at the Kerrang Airport to commemorate his achievements. More than 3,000 Australian women served as nurses during World War I, most with the Australian Army Nursing Service, though many more served with other services such as the Red Cross. 25 women died during their service. The nurses worked in hospitals, on hospital ships and trains, or in casualty clearing stations closer to the front line. They served in locations from Britain to India, taking in France and Belgium, the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Many of them were decorated, with 8 receiving the Military Medal for Bravery. 2 nurses are named on the Gannawarra Shire honour rolls, one of whom is Elizabeth O'Reilly, who resided on a farm near Leachville. She enlisted on the 15th of July 1915 as a staff nurse at the age of 34 and trained at a Melbourne hospital before embarking for Egypt. Elizabeth served several months in Ismailia and Alexandria hospitals before continuing on to England and then to France, where she spent the greater part of the war in Rouen. She was granted leave for almost 2 months to attend the Royal Sanitary Institute in London after being promoted to sister in 1918, also being mentioned in dispatches for conspicuous service at the front. On the 11th of November, as the armistice was being signed, Elizabeth was on leave in Paris, where crowds gathered to celebrate the end of the war. Elizabeth returned to Australia in August 1919, and her appointment in the Australian Army Medical Corps terminated on the 14th of November, just over a year after the war came to a close. Upon returning to Australia, Elizabeth resided with her brother, James, on his farm just outside Leachville for several years before moving to the Melbourne area to continue nursing. Like many women of her era, she did not marry, and records indicate that Elizabeth O'Reilly died on the 6th of January 1964 in Armidale, Victoria. Reasons for signing up to go to war varied, from some relishing the prospect of seeing the world, to assured employment for unskilled workers, to a deep sense of patriotism and the service of king and country. The Turner family from Kahuna were prominent in the war effort in the Gannawarra region. When the call to war came, the Turner family answered with vigour. Recruiting was opened in Australia on the 14th of August 1914, and less than a month later, John, known as Jack, the youngest sibling of 8, enlisted as a private in the AIF. He was 21 years old and is listed as a divinity student at the Church of England College at Bendigo. By the 20th of October, he was embarking overseas, arriving in Cairo early December 1914 and commencing his training. 4 months later, Jack's battalion proceeded to Gallipoli. He managed 20 days fighting on the beaches and hills before he was wounded with a bullet through his right shoulder. He was transferred to hospital in Malta to recover from his wound for 7 months. Jack returned to Gallipoli, but in November he was again admitted to hospital with jaundice and a sore on his leg. He stayed in hospital for just over a month before returning to Gallipoli in December 1915. On New Year's Day 1916, Jack was promoted to the rank of corporal and the next day embarked from Lemnos back to Alexandria in Egypt. By February of 1916, 3 of Jack's 4 brothers had also enlisted and were on their way to war. When Jack marched into France midway through 1916, he had again been promoted, this time to quartermaster sergeant. After just over a month in the trenches, Jack was once again wounded in action, sustaining a gunshot wound to the head. He was transported back to England and admitted to hospital for over 40 days. In mid-September, Jack, who was now a second lieutenant and somewhat recovered from his wound, marched back into France. On his way there, he managed to meet up with his brother Jim, newly arrived in England. Jim wrote a letter home to tell of the meeting.
I saw Jack. He's a second lieutenant now and was here for a night to take a draft of troops to France, so I was very lucky to see him. He looks splendid and seems to have had exceptional luck as his company has been terrible cut up. All the officers killed or wounded. He was wounded in the head. The wound is hardly healed up yet. He tells me that he would have been killed only for the steel helmet that he was wearing turned the bullet and it only went through the side of his head.
In February 1917, Jack is again wounded in action, this time a gunshot wound to his arm. Once again he recovered in hospital in England. The bullet had entered through his arm and travelled into his shoulder, but had not emerged. As the entry wound had healed and there seemed no nerve or bone damage, his physicians made the decision to leave it there. Jack was also quarantined for measles during his hospital stay. During April and May 1917, all 4 Turner brothers are in hospital. Jack recovering from his wound, Tom and Keppel were ill, and Jim, who was also wounded in action, recorded as shrapnel wounds to the chest and right leg. This ultimately resulted in the amputation of his right leg above the knee. He recounts how he came to be wounded in a letter home.
Our lads took all the trenches and held them against all counterattacks. I received 2 wounds, one right through the leg below the knee, the other through the right side of the chest low down. I was lying out alone for 16 hours and also down a dugout for another 18 hours before I was taken to a dressing station.
Arrangements were made to send Jim home to Australia, But in the meantime, Jack had recovered and rejoined his battalion in France. He was now acting second in command. But on September the 26th, 1917, Jack's luck finally ran out. As acting commander of the 59th Battalion, he was tasked with clearing a German pillbox during the battle at Polygon Wood. The Allies needed to break through the German line of machine guns. In an article written by Major General H.E. Elliott in 1930, he describes Jack's last actions.
Having got his men in position, he placed himself in the centre of the arc, where all could see him, and directly opposite the centre loophole from which the machine gun was firing. Suddenly, springing up to his feet, he waved the men forward and led them on. Several times he seemed to stagger, but still kept his feet and hardly checked his forward rush. The enemy gun spurting flame at the loophole and bullets raising dust all around him. Just as he had almost reached the gun, he fell forward, dying. But his work was done. Already the men had got round and thrown their bombs into the pillbox, with deadly effect.
Jack's last actions created a hole in the German machine gun line for the Allies to pour through and attack from the rear, turning the tide of the battle. A painting of the moment, Jack Turner from Kahuna stood up to draw the enemy fire while his men flanked the pillbox, hangs in the Australian War Memorial. He was 24 when he died, after serving 3 years fighting and suffering 6 woundings. As his family grieved for their youngest member, they were not to know that only 15 days later they would be mourning another sibling. On the 12th of October, Tom took part in a battle at Passendale as part of the 38th Battalion. They were beaten back by heavy machine gun fire and shelling. When the smoke cleared, Tom Turner was one of 99 men declared missing in action that day. No trace of him was ever found. He was 37 years old and had served in the armed forces for 1 year and 8 months. Only 2 Turner brothers returned from war. Keppel left the district, but Jim stayed to raise a family in Kahuna, overcoming his disability of a missing limb and running a cattle farm for many years. At the outbreak of the war, large numbers of Australians came forward to enlist, and Aboriginal Australians also answered the call. Best current estimates are that about 1,000 Indigenous Australians out of an estimated population of 93,000 in 1901 fought in the First World War, though the real number is most likely higher. Indigenous Australians were motivated to join the Australian Imperial Force by the need to protect their people and land. Descendants of these men attribute their enlistments to traditional roles for men as warriors and defenders within the tribe. Additionally, there was the prospect of receiving a wage in a time when very few Aboriginal men were compensated for any work they performed, let alone at a fair rate. Indigenous soldiers were paid the same rate as non-Indigenous soldiers. In general, they served under the same conditions of service as other members of the AIF, with many experiencing in the Army almost equal treatment for the first time in their lives. There may have also been the hope that having served would deliver greater equality after the war. In reality, however, upon their return to civilian life, they were treated with the same prejudice and discrimination as before. There is also evidence that some Aboriginal men tried to sign up multiple times early in the war, but were rebuffed. Later, as the need for more men became dire and enlistment regulations were somewhat relaxed, more were accepted. The Firebrace family of Merlimene sent 3 family members to fight for King and Country. The Firebraces were descended from a prominent settler family after whom the main street in Horsham is named. Brothers Arthur and William, along with their nephew John, were working as boundary riders and station hands at the Char Sing station near Merlimene, and were members of the Wemba Wemba and Waddy Waddy tribes. 39-year-old Arthur and 18-year-old John both signed up in March of 1916. They embarked from Melbourne on the 21st of November 1917 and both trained with the 10th Training Battalion in England. Both men were transferred to the 7th Battalion before proceeding overseas to France. Both men also suffered greatly with trench feet. This was a painful condition that widely affected troops in the cold and wet trenches. Feet became swollen, soft and infected. Some cases resulted in amputation. Arthur was transferred to the Australian Army Medical Corps, where he worked at a convalescent home. But the condition of trench foot and rheumatoid in his shoulder eventually ended Arthur's service. He was returned to Australia in March 1919, having seen the end of the war and being discharged as medically unfit. As a result of his feat, John spent the most part of a year in military depots in England. He was then transferred to the 66th Battalion and promoted to Lance Corporal. In October 1917, John had returned to the field in France. Then on the day following the Battle of Amiens in early August, John was escorting German prisoners to Allied headquarters and cleaning up German machine gun posts. In the late morning, John was mortally wounded in an open stretch of country near the town of Arbonnières. He is buried at the Heath Cemetery in Picardy, France. William Firebrace enlisted in July 1917. He was 22 years old and single. His brother and nephew had been serving overseas for over a year. William proceeded overseas to France in May 1918 and after a few weeks in military camp was hospitalised with high fever. From the 16th of June, William served with his battalion on the front in France. He took part in the Battle of Hamel on the 4th of July 1918, a successful Allied offensive that took German positions and captured 1,000 German prisoners. He was in the field during the Battle of Amiens, where his nephew was killed. Then only a few days later, on the 15th of August 1918, William was killed instantly by an enemy shell while standing near an ambulance wagon after he had been gassed. William was reburied at the Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery. The Firebrace family were deeply impacted by the loss of their family members in the First World War and gained little in the receipt of repatriation benefits. However, this did not stop some members of the next generation of men also volunteering to fight in the Second World War. Edward Simons of Kundruk was only 18 years and 2 months old when he enlisted on the 10th of February 1916. His young age required specific permission from his parents to join. He marched into France 7 months later, fighting at the front in Et Pals. This is where he contracted mumps, a painful swelling of the salivary glands causing difficulty in eating and drinking. Edward was removed from the front to hospital on the 16th of March 1917. Released after a 5-day stay, he relapsed and was again admitted, this time for over 3 weeks. Once rejoined to his company, Edward continued to fight on in France for a year until the 16th of April 1918, when he was wounded in battle and died in hospital the same day. Edward was just 20 years old. His grave resides in the Bory churchyard in France. Edward's family were devastated at hearing of his death and waited for his possessions to be delivered home. As they did not arrive, his mother wrote to ask when they would be receiving his effects. A major on base in Australia replied to Mrs. Simons to state that the ship carrying the consignment containing Edward's possessions was attacked by the enemy and sank with all cargo. His family never received any of his possessions. Over 1,100 men and women from the Gannawarra district served in the Australian Imperial Forces during World War I. Every one of them has a story. Up to 180 never returned. Many of those who did had received life-changing wounds, both mental and physical. For Australia, the First World War remains the costliest conflict in terms of death and casualties. From a population of fewer than 5 million, 416,809 men enlisted, of whom more than 60,000 were killed and 156,000 wounded, gassed or taken prisoner. This war to end all wars had a profound impact on our community. A weight of grief to be borne, a loss of innocence never to be regained. Beyond the battle, we can only hope to learn and understand.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning we will remember them.